Hello traders! Join me as I take you back to an extraordinary moment in history, a time when the global economy was facing significant challenges, and five of the world's major powers decided to come together in an unprecedented show of cooperation. I am speaking, of course, about the Plaza Accord, an agreement that fundamentally reshaped international economic relations and financial markets in the mid-1980s. This was a moment where leadership, diplomacy, and economic strategy combined to address the escalating trade imbalances and economic strains that threatened global stability. It's a story that offers powerful lessons, not just for economists, but for anyone interested in the complex interplay of global forces. So, what was the Plaza Accord? Picture this, it's September 1985. The location is New York City, specifically the elegant Plaza Hotel. Inside, the finance ministers and central bank governors of five of the world's largest economies, namely the United States, Japan, West Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, have gathered for a pivotal discussion. These nations were not just economic giants, they were key political players with a shared understanding that the global economy needed urgent intervention. At the heart of this meeting was a problem of considerable scale. The US dollar had risen to unsustainable heights, creating wide-ranging consequences that were rippling across the world. You see, in the early 1980s, a combination of US policies had driven the dollar to appreciate sharply. Under President Ronald Reagan's administration, the US was implementing a mix of expansionary fiscal policies, think tax cuts, increased defense spending, while the Federal Reserve was simultaneously raising interest rates to control inflation. These measures led to an influx of capital into the United States, which naturally caused the dollar to soar in value on the foreign exchange markets. Now, while this was great news for American consumers who enjoyed cheap imports and a booming domestic economy, it was wreaking havoc on US manufacturers and exporters. And why was that? Quite simply, as the dollar became stronger, US goods became more expensive in foreign markets, making them less competitive. The result was a growing trade deficit for the United States and increasing frustration among American industries. In parallel, countries like Japan and West Germany were facing the opposite problem. Their currencies were undervalued relative to the dollar, giving their exports a competitive edge and creating large trade surpluses. But these surpluses were becoming politically untenable, both within their own borders and internationally, as the imbalances grew larger. The international economic landscape at that time was tense, to say the least. And something had to be done. The US was pressing for a solution, not just because of the strain on its own industries, but because there was a growing recognition that these imbalances could spark broader political and economic instability if left unaddressed. And so, it was at the Plaza Hotel that this high-stakes meeting took place, where leaders from these five nations would ultimately agree on a course of action that would go down in history as the Plaza Accord. Now, what was decided in that room? At the heart of the Plaza Accord was a simple yet profound agreement. The five nations collectively recognized that the US dollar had become too strong and needed to be brought down to more sustainable levels. They committed to a coordinated intervention in the global currency markets. Essentially, the plan was to weaken the dollar by selling off large amounts of it and buying their own currencies, namely the Japanese yen and the German Deutsche Mark. This was a big deal because it marked one of the first times that major world powers had cooperated so closely on a matter of such critical financial importance. They were taking decisive action together, knowing that unilateral efforts wouldn't suffice. But this wasn't just about tinkering with exchange rates. The Plaza Accord also laid out the groundwork for broader economic adjustments. The United States, for example, agreed to take measures to reduce its budget deficits, while Japan and West Germany were encouraged to stimulate domestic demand. In other words, everyone had their part to play, not just in adjusting their currencies but in rebalancing their economies. And this cooperation between nations was a sign that the world was entering a new era of economic interdependence. The impact of the Plaza Accord was almost immediate. Within days of the announcement, the dollar began to fall against the yen and the Deutsche Mark, which was precisely the intended outcome. And over the next 2 years, the dollar would drop by about 50% against the yen and 40% against the Deutsche Mark. This dramatic shift in exchange rates helped to ease some of the pressure on US exporters, who suddenly found themselves back in the game, so to speak. American goods became more competitively priced abroad, and this contributed to a reduction in the US trade deficit, a win for those industries that had been struggling under the weight of the strong dollar. But let's not pretend it was all smooth sailing from there. For Japan and West Germany, the appreciation of their currencies created new challenges. In Japan, for example, the rising yen started to take a toll on the export-driven sectors that had been fueling its economic boom. Japanese goods were becoming more expensive abroad, and growth began to slow. This was a serious concern for a country that had built much of its post-war success on strong export performance. In response, Japan's central bank took aggressive steps to ease monetary policy, cutting interest rates in an effort to stimulate the domestic economy. Unfortunately, this is where the unintended consequences of the Plaza Accord began to rear their head. While the monetary easing helped in the short term, it also led to the formation of speculative bubbles, particularly in the stock market and real estate. By the late 1980s, Japan was in the midst of a full-blown asset bubble, and when that bubble eventually burst in the early 1990s, it set off a period of economic stagnation that would come to be known as Japan's lost decade. The Plaza Accord, which had initially seemed like a triumph of diplomacy and economic coordination, ended up being a contributing factor to one of the most challenging periods in modern Japanese history. And what about West Germany? Well, the stronger Deutsche Mark helped to control inflation, which had been a concern in Germany at the time, but it also slowed economic growth as German exports became more expensive. Nonetheless, the German economy proved more resilient in the face of these challenges, thanks in part to its strong industrial base and domestic institutions. But the broader point here is that while the Plaza Accord achieved its immediate goals, it also set off a chain of events that would have long-lasting effects, particularly in Japan. In the United States, the Plaza Accord was initially hailed as a success. The dollar's depreciation did indeed help to reduce the trade deficit and gave US exporters some much-needed breathing room. But the structural issues that had contributed to the trade imbalance in the first place, things like the decline in manufacturing competitiveness and the growing consumer demand for imports, weren't fully addressed by the Plaza Accord alone. And so, while the agreement helped to stabilize the situation in the short term, it wasn't a panacea for the deeper challenges facing the US economy. The story of the Plaza Accord doesn't end there, though. By the late 1980s, it became clear that the dollar had fallen far enough, perhaps even too far. Concerns were growing that if the dollar continued to decline, it could destabilize the global economy in new ways. And so, in 1987, the same nations that had signed the Plaza Accord came back together to strike a new agreement, known as the Louvre Accord. This time, the goal was to halt the dollar's decline and stabilize exchange rates. The Louvre Accord marked a shift away from active currency intervention and toward a greater emphasis on domestic economic policies as the primary tools for managing trade imbalances. In many ways, the Louvre Accord was a recognition that while currency interventions can be powerful, they're not a long-term solution to the complex problems facing the global economy. And so, the era of aggressive currency management that began with the Plaza Accord came to an end. But the lessons of the Plaza Accord continue to resonate. It was a moment that demonstrated the power of international cooperation when nations are willing to come together and work toward a common goal. It showed that economic challenges don't stop at national borders and that, in an interconnected world, countries often have more to gain by working together than by going it alone. The Plaza Accord also served as a cautionary tale, reminding us that even well-intentioned policies can have unintended consequences. Japan's lost decade, in particular, is a stark reminder of the risks that come with rapid economic shifts and the importance of carefully managing those transitions. In conclusion, the Plaza Accord was a landmark event that reshaped the global economy and set the stage for future efforts at international economic coordination. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it remains one of the most significant examples of nations coming together to address a shared challenge. And as we look to the future, with new economic challenges on the horizon, the spirit of cooperation that defined the Plaza Accord is something we should all strive to emulate. I'm Erica Trina, your host from Sen Securities. Thank you.